Bonjour mes amis qui aiment les livres. I'm in Paris today. If you're new here, I'm Elizabeth from A Suitcase Full of Books, and there are so many books that take place in Paris. So today we're gonna go explore some of the locations that relate to a bunch of books that take place in Paris. And there's a lot to get through, so let's get going. Hungry? How about breakfast? When I think of breakfast in Paris, I think pain au chocolat and other pastries. So this is not the breakfast place I expected to find myself at, but before my trip, my good friend Aunt Jeanette, who's also on BookTube at the Book Barista, gave me a book called Pancakes in Paris, and the author is an American who came to Paris and started the first American diner called Breakfast in Paris, BIA, which is behind me. So, of course, I had to check it out. So we're gonna go see how this greasy spoon compares to actual American diners. I can't wait to have a good hearty American breakfast this morning. From the book, I learned that BIA often hosted viewing parties for things like American presidential candidate debates. And with one happening within the week, we asked the waiter if this was still true. Unfortunately, we learned the restaurant was sold before the pandemic to a French conglomerate, and the waiter was unaware of any plans to host viewings. Well, that was the breakfast that I didn't know I needed. It was delicious. All right, on to our next stop. Okay, I have a little bit of a confession to make. I can't possibly carry all the books that I read about Paris in my suitcase. So we're going to use a library to go find some of them. And it just so happens that there is an American library in Paris. So we're going to go use the American library. Okay, it's a little hot in here for the beret. So I've got my visitor pass. So we're gonna go look for some books. The first book is The Paris Library. This is actually a historical fiction about the American Library in Paris. And we already happen to be here, but luckily, every Friday at 11 a.m. there's a library history lecture, and we're going to go attend that to learn more about the actual people and the history that shows up in this book and find out what's fact and what's fiction. So let's go do that. The Paris Library by Janet Skesley and Charles is a historical fiction about librarians at the American Library during World War II who smuggled books to Jewish constituents while they were not allowed to visit the library. The history tour, which was more of a lecture, gave us an overview of the library's history since its founding, but focused on World War II because so many had come to the tour because of the book.
We also had paper on our windows with tape to make sure that if the windows fell in, people were not.
We got to see photos and learn the real history of people the book was based on.
So they all came back to the library, except for Evangeline and Olivia.
And yes, the book's misreader was real.
Became the directress in 1936 when none of the guys wanted the job because it didn't pay enough.
All right, let's go find the next book. Sylvia Beach wrote about her own history and her shop, this Shakespeare and Company English language bookstore, but this one is a little harder to get into, so I would actually recommend reading the historical fiction version, The Paris Bookseller. Let's go find that one. The next book is The Paris Bookseller. This is about Sylvia Beach and her starting her famous Shakespeare and Company bookstore in the Left Bank. So let's go check that out.
Breakfast in America actually has two branches, and the original one is in the Latin Quarter. So that's where we had breakfast so that we could see the original one. But now we have come to the next famous place in the Latin Quarter, which is also for English-speaking people, the English language bookstore Shakespeare and Company. Now, the original Shakespeare and Company, started by Sylvia Beach, was actually on another street in Paris. This one behind me was actually started by another man later, and it had a different name, and then he later changed the name of this bookstore to Shakespeare and Company in homage to Sylvia Beach. And then he named his daughter Sylvia after Sylvia Beach, and she is the current owner of this bookstore behind me. So I'm really, really, really excited to be here. And there's actually a specific reason I came. This Shakespeare and Company has an exclusive version of the book, The Hunchback of Notre Dame, because Notre Dame is actually just across the street, and we'll see that in a little bit. So I want to go inside and get a copy of this book that you can only get here. You can actually order it online, but it's not as fun as coming here to get it. And I can't take any pictures or videos inside of the store because it is a haven for, or a retreat for writers and readers, and they don't want anybody being distracted or getting in the way of other people trying to take videos and photos. So unfortunately, you'll have to visit yourself to see what the inside looks like. But I am going to go inside and find a copy of this book, and then we will continue on. All right. Found it. It was just inside the doorway, so it wasn't very hard to find. And also, when you buy it here, they stamp it with their stamp, so that's cool. Now I have an exclusive version of The Hunchback of Notre Dame, which takes place literally right there. Unfortunately, Notre Dame is not open. It's scheduled to reopen in December, so we won't be able to go to Notre Dame today, but we will by book. So I think we'll keep walking to the next place.
Instead of crossing the river to Notre Dame, let's check out the bouquiniste stalls that line the Seine. These are secondhand booksellers that have been a Paris institution since the 16th century. If you're looking for souvenirs, I recommend getting them at these stalls rather than the sketchy-feeling souvenir shops. And definitely don't buy anything from the teams of hawkers that hang out at the popular Eiffel Tower viewing locations. Those guys are actually selling illegally.
I had to buy some souvenirs from the bouquinistas, so I bought a bookmark, some postcards, and they all have these little keychains that look exactly like the one from Emily in Paris. So yeah, I had to get one. Thank God, no?
Aha, a movable feast. Okay, speaking of the left bank lost generation authors, of course we have to talk about Hemingway. So the next book is A Movable Feast. He wrote this book about Paris, and he is famous for eating at several establishments in the left bank, but we're going to go check out one of them. So let's go.
When you mention Paris and literature, most people think of the 1920s American expat community of writers that was living in the Latin Quarter of Paris and became known as the Lost Generation. This included literary greats like Ernest Hemingway, James Joyce, F. Scott Fitzgerald, and several others. Before reading The Paris Bookseller, all I knew about them was they used to frequently eat at Les Deux Magots. After reading the book, I wanted to walk the streets where these famous writers once gathered and learn more about them. So I found a guide who took us on a 3-hour walking tour through the Latin district. We walked Rue de l'Odéon, where Sylvia Beach had her Shakespeare and Company bookstore and lending library. Beach and her bookstore became famous for publishing James Joyce's book Ulysses when nobody else would. And her partner, Adrienne Monnier, had her French bookstore, La Maison des Amis des Livres, across the street. The expat community centered around these shops, and we saw 3 locations where Ernest Hemingway lived at different times.
He spread from his first wife because he had an affair with another woman, which will become his second wife.
And we saw like 5 different restaurants that are famous because Hemingway and Fitzgerald used to frequent them. And we saw the building where Gertrude Stein used to hold her famous salons that anybody who was anybody was seen attending.
So their family made a fortune. The parents were not rich. They came from Germany. They were Jewish from Germany, and they made fortune with transportation.
And the works of Victor Hugo. The Hunchback of Notre Dame. Unfortunately, Notre Dame of Paris is closed right now. It should open in December of this year, but we can go visit Victor Hugo's house. So let's go there.
Victor Hugo's House Museum is free to visit, and there's an app you can download on your phone for an audio guide tour. Hugo and his family lived in a second-story apartment in the Place des Vosges. Each of their former rooms has been decorated to represent a different period of Hugo's life. Although there's little furniture left, one of my favorite pieces was a writing table with ink pots from 4 authors, including Hugo and Alexandre Dumas. One room documented the period of time Hugo exiled himself from France in Guernsey, England, because he did not agree with the Napoleonic Empire. He actually wrote his famous Les Mis in exile.
In Guernsey, Hugo became accustomed to writing standing up.
I think he must have been a very tall man, because there's no way I could write at the desk where he wrote Les Mis.
Did you know that Victor Hugo was lifelong friends with Alexandre Dumas, the author of The Count of Monte Cristo? So let's go talk about him next. That's the famous 5. I didn't expect to find this here. And Sharon Creech books, and the Hardy Boys. Oh, I used to love these books, the Dear America books. Okay. Next book is The Count of Monte Cristo. Did you know you can visit the author's home? Let's go.
Behind me is the Chateau de Monte Cristo, which is the castle home that author Alexandre Dumas built for himself and named after his famous work. And you can see from the outside of the castle that he led a bit of an extravagant lifestyle. So we're gonna go inside and tour to not only learn about his extravagant lifestyle, but his really fascinating life story, during which he started as a copyist and then fell in love with the theater in Paris and started writing plays, and then eventually started his own theater, and then eventually he became a novelist and started his own newspapers so that he could publish his own novels in his papers, and that's where he published his very famous The Count of Monte Cristo and the Three Musketeers, and then he himself adapted those into plays to lead people back to the theater. So we're going to go learn all about that in the castle.
This room exemplifies Dumas's extravagance. He contracted a father and son duo he met while traveling in Tunisia to create a Tunisian-style salon in his home. This is a Three Musketeers theater costume, and these are some of the newspapers Dumas created and published. Interestingly, the majority of Dumas's body of works are plays. His Count of Monte Cristo adaptation was a 2-night theater affair, and according to the museum docent, his plays haven't been performed in France in the last 13 years. Possibly most interesting, Dumas loved to cook and hosted lavish luncheons. He was writing a culinary dictionary when he died and even wrote that he hoped to be remembered for his cooking above all else. Dumas's cookbook was published posthumously by his son.
We're gonna head up to his personal little writing retreat that he built just opposite his castle and named Chateau d'If.
This would be such a cool place to write. I was also fascinated to learn that Dumas was a travel writer. He was commissioned by the French government to visit Algeria after it was conquered by France and promote it as a great place for the French public to relocate to.
Let's go. Okay, so the next book is not exactly a children's book, but the adult version was checked out, so we're going to go with the easy reader version in the children's section. The Phantom of the Opera is one of my favorite musicals, but did you know that it started as a book and the book is fantastic? So we're going to go check out the Opera House where this story takes place.
I've booked an after-hours tour of the Palais Garnier, their mystery tour, in English. So let's go see where the Phantom of the Opera's box is.
We nearly had the place to ourselves. During the after-hours tour, there's only 2 small groups in the building, one following an English-speaking guide and the other following a French-speaking guide. We learned all about Charles Garnier, who designed and built the building, and if you're wondering if there's a lake beneath the building, there is. It's a cistern, and the only people allowed down there are firefighters for dark water rescue practice. Luckily, there was no opera playing the night we were there, so we got to go in the auditorium and see the famous chandelier. Of course, most of our group just wanted to know where Box 5 was, the Phantom's box. Gaston Leroux, the author of The Phantom of the Opera, swore till his death that the Phantom was real. Whether he is or not, Box 5 has his name on the door. But no angry phantom appeared when I took a seat in his box. Nor did he appear in the ballroom where the masquerade parties were once held.
What did you think? Did you love the Opera House? That was so cool. All right, let's go check out the next book. Okay, we gotta talk about the Da Vinci Code. This is gonna take us to the Louvre.
I don't know about you, but I can't see the Louvre pyramids without thinking of the Da Vinci Code. Anyway, while at the Louvre, I saw the highlights, the Winged Victory, Mona Lisa, and if you've read my Holland blog post, you know I love Vermeer's works. But the real reason I visited the Louvre is to see this vase. It once belonged to Queen Eleanor of Aquitaine. She is my favorite historical figure thanks to historical fiction author Sharon K. Penman. This is the closest I'll ever come to an item once held by Eleanor and visited by Penman.
I am exhausted and need to go rest my feet. So we need to go somewhere where we can sit down. And then there's the Paris Letters. This book is written by an author who used to sit and write and draw in the Garden du Luxembourg, so that seems like a really nice place to go sit right now.
Author Janice McLeod fell in love with Paris while visiting and found herself sitting in the Jardin du Luxembourg trying to come up with an idea that would allow her to stay in the city long term. What she came up with is turning her hobby of sketching and journaling in this garden into a subscription letter service. She would send out a monthly watercolor painting on which she'd write a short letter to her subscribers. Today you can buy copies of some of these letters on the author's Etsy shop. I hoped if I came and sat with a book in the Jardin du Luxembourg, I'd come up with an equally good idea to let me stay in Paris. Unfortunately, I'm not as artistic as McLeod, and so I guess it's time to head back to the library. There's one more thing we need to do before leaving Paris, and that is pay our respects at the final resting place of several of the great authors that we've talked about. So we've come out to Père Lachaise Cemetery, and while several of the lost generation authors or expat Americans did return home and are buried in their respective places in America, Gertrude Stein, who was a patron of several of them, is buried here, as well as the author Oscar Wilde and several other famous people. So we're gonna go find their final resting places and pay our respects. So let's go. One of the most famous graves in this cemetery is Oscar Wilde's. He was not part of the lost generation. He's actually from Dublin, Ireland, but he had to flee his home for being gay, and so he fled to France and changed his name even, but he's buried here in Paris under his original name of Oscar Wilde, and his tomb is actually famous for being kissed, and so people like to leave lip marks. The family had to clean his tomb. It's now been cleaned and encased with a glass. So now it seems people are kissing the glass still, but at least the tomb is clean. So here we are, and we're gonna go pay our respects. Gertrude Stein's salons were legendary. It's humbling to be standing here at her graveside. However, the larger-than-life Parisian authors Victor Hugo and Alexandre Dumas, as well as several other very famous Parisians, have been laid to rest here at the Pantheon, so we're going to go pay our respects here. The Pantheon crypt has a touchscreen map to help you locate the tombs you're looking for. I made a quick stop at Voltaire's tomb where I had flashbacks of high school French lessons. Then found the writer's vault where Victor Hugo, Alexandre Dumas, and Émile Zola are all laid to rest. Merci, mes amis, for coming along on that whirlwind literary tour of Paris. You may have noticed that there were a few different outfit changes in this video, and that's because it's impossible to see all of the locations in this video in one day. So if you do want to see some of these locations yourself, make sure to check out the corresponding blog post to this video, because I'll be giving tips about how to get around Paris. Make sure to also connect with me on social media, give this video a big thumbs up, and I'll see you in the next video. Au revoir!